Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Debbie Fox with the National Network in Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, and so we work in partnership with Collaborative Solutions, who are on the call today. We have Jill Robertson from Collaborative Solutions with us. We also work with the National Alliance for Safe Housing and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and the National Resource Center on Sexual Violence. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our state spotlight for West Virginia on comparable databases for victim service providers. So we have a very unique perspective today with Aaron Dunn, who has led both HMIS and comparable databases in West Virginia. He's currently in a role in a new position as the HMIS product manager for Ecovia Solutions, and then he also is still operating the statewide database, and he's a statewide database coordinator for the domestic violence and sexual violence programs in West Virginia. So today you'll hear more from Aaron about his process of operating a comparable database. And then we also, Jill and I will be fielding questions in the chat box during the webinar, so please feel free to ask questions and engage with us, and we'll be responding as questions come up. And then we'll have time at the end to chat and for Aaron to ask questions at the end of the PowerPoint. So the goal of our work and the work of the DV and Housing TA Consortium is to really bring out what we're hearing and highlighting what's happening in the field, and to share information and innovative solutions to what's happening in the work that we're doing across the country. And just to give a very high level, like bird's eye overview before Aaron gets started, as many of you all know, and many of you are have received funding, there is a lot more resources and focus on serving domestic and sexual violence survivors with HUD Continuum of Care funds with the DV bonus funds, and so there's ongoing appropriations from starting in fiscal year 18 to last year. There was a NOFA with bonus funds that went out for $50 million that should be released any day, and then we're hoping this summer as well there'll be continued appropriations for the field. So we're looking at $150 million potentially with all those resources going out, and that's a whole lot of new projects for domestic violence survivors, and a whole need to be able to report and have the comparable database solutions to be competitive and to report what you need to report to your continuums of care and to HUD, so you can continue receiving these funding streams in the future. I just want to make sure to see, Jill, if you have anything to add as our HUD TA provider partner on the call before we turn it over to Aaron. Do you want to just say a quick hello and talk about your work at Collaborative Solutions?
Certainly. Thanks, Debbie. Appreciate that. So I'm Jill Robertson. I'm one of the program managers at Collaborative Solutions. One of my focuses is on domestic violence and sexual assault. I also do some work around tribal initiatives, have quite a bit of experience in the past with the HMIS and comparable databases. So really glad to be joining you today. Feel free to just toss out any questions you might have, and one of us will try to get those answered. So I guess I'll turn this back over to you, Debbie, or Aaron.
Thanks, Jill. I think we can go ahead and get started. So Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you and have you lead the webinar for the next hour. So thank you, Aaron, so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And greetings, everyone. As Debbie stated, my new role is the HMIS product manager for Ecovia Solutions, which is a HMIS vendor. And then, on the side, I'm also the statewide comparable database coordinator for domestic violence and sexual assault in West Virginia. And so we'll look at a little bit more at exactly what that means. But, I've been working with databases now for 5 or 6 years. You kind of lose track of the time. So I'm just going to share some of my experiences with you all and kind of what's going on in West Virginia at this time. So I know some of you are aware, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, what exactly, is a comparable database, right? And so a comparable database is usually used for victim service providers, DV organizations or SA organizations. and it is a HUD compliant database, which means that it's collecting most of the fields that HUD kind of requires from their funders or funding partners. There are some exceptions, right? The reason we're kind of talking about this, once again, as Debbie highlighted, is that as we go forward, HUD is releasing more money, for domestic violence programs to apply for specifically DV funding, which is a very exciting time, I think. So with comparable databases, that's definitely a huge piece of it, that, these organizations need to be able to track their clients' information, to kind of deduplicate all that jazz. With comparable databases, too, some COCs kind of require, an agreed-upon structure with the victim service providers. It varies COC by COC. But that's just so you can coordinate with your COC, Continuum of Care, and make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page with that. So whenever you're looking for a comparable database, there are definitely some questions that you're going to have to be asking yourselves as you go along. Over the past year and a half or so, West Virginia has decided to kind of broaden its scope and look into different comparable database solutions. And as their comparable database coordinator, I was kind of tasked with going out and finding what solutions may work for us, what solutions had to offer, things like that. And so as I went through, that process, kind of these four main questions really were at the forefront of my mind. Obviously, with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, we want to make sure that their data is completely secure, right? And with that security, there are some questions that you have to ask. Is essentially, where is the data going to live, right? And so is that data going to live on a server that the organization maintains on site, a remote server that you contract or a third party with, or is it cloud-based? And if it's cloud-based, what are the security measures for that? The next question is, obviously, is it going to meet my reporting requirements? And so from that DVSA standpoint, we've got VOCA, VAWA, SASP, all of that. But again, as we go forward with this HUD funding availability, we also need to be able to report on some of the HUD elements or ESG elements, which is the Emergency Solutions Grant. And then, the next question is, will it assist me with my clients, right? Is this going to be a burden for me to enter and not really do much more than that, kind of a begrudging acceptance? Or is this going to be a tool that I can use to better assist my clients, to better kind of track their case and what's going on with them and how best to assist them? And then lastly, my main question was, who is going to have access to this database, which definitely ties back into that first point of, is it secure, right? So whenever you're looking at comparable databases, I would definitely recommend that these are kind of the four questions that you keep in the forefront of your mind going forward. All right, and so my graphics messed up. That's all right. So this slide is looking out for clients' data, right? And so in my journey looking into different database solutions, one of the things I definitely kind of came across was what I called pop-up vendors. And these are small or newer software vendors that, for whatever reason, aren't super compliant with the regulations that we need. So that's definitely something that you need to take into account as you're going through this process. You want to be aware of the security standards that are required by HUD, VOCA, VAWA, all that. And then you kind of want to extrapolate that information and look at how these vendors are operating their software. Are they going to be compliant? Are they not? Where are they located is kind of a big issue. One of the things I kind of came across was that there are a bunch of overseas or not American-based database companies, which is fine. But in some cases, I definitely came across the interaction where they didn't fully understand the HUD regulations or the VAWA regulations. So that's definitely something that you should kind of keep in mind going forward. And then obviously, a database's reputation. In this current digital age, pretty much if anything's on a computer, it's going to try to be hacked, right? So you definitely want to kind of look at that solution's reputation, kind of what their history looks like with that. So that's just something you need to keep in mind. And then looking out, again, for clients' data with there's kind of an intersection between the HUD and the VAWA standards. So HUD likes to see, that Social Security number and that Social Security data quality, whether you've gotten the full social or partial or whatever the case may be. VAWA, however, restricts that. We don't really want to see a Social Security under the VAWA standards. And so with those two things in mind, you really should kind of understand both requirements and how they interact with one another. HUD has kind of come forward and said that a client refused in regards to Social Security numbers from a DV and SA standpoint is acceptable, right? They make those allowances. And then once again, just that company's kind of physical location is something that you should keep in mind. And so in West Virginia, we are always unique, but within West Virginia, we work within a statewide implementation for both HMIS and the comparable database solution. So with HMIS, that's pretty straightforward. The HMIS statewide implementation is a open solution, which means that the COCs can see what the other COCs are entering into the system, what clients they've served, things to that nature. Obviously, the releases of information and privacy practices and policies are in place. But with the comparable database solution in West Virginia, we operate under what's called a closed system. So what that means is that each individual project is siloed. So if you're at Project A and you want to see Project B's information, assuming both are DV providers, you can't do that. They can't access one another's data. They can't really even think about it too hard. The benefit of having this kind of statewide implementation is that it does kind of ensure that standardization of data collection across the programs, which is very handy, especially when it comes to reporting time. So, there are 14 DV programs in West Virginia and 3 standalone sexual assault agencies. And, they pretty much collect all the same data. They're using the same program. It's just limited to their specific organization. And for those of you that may be asking, how it works with me is I have access to a demo site, and that's all that I have access to. I do not have access to any of the program's live information. So I use that demo site to provide trainings, to work through any sort of technical issues they may have, which goes back on my earlier point of that standardization, that we're all on the same program, even that demo program. So I'm able to work through any issues that the programs may be having. With that statewide implementation as well, with that same program, it definitely assists in applying for that federal funding that is becoming available, as well as, that ESG funding, or which you need that CABR report for. Some of our organizations in West Virginia have already applied for that new HUD federal funding, with more of them expressing interest in coming years. So with that capability already built into our comparable database, that ability to export those CSV files that HUD likes to see, having that already built in really facilitates programs' decisions as to whether they should apply for funding or not. And then with that statewide implementation, with both HMIS and that comparable database, I have found that it's helpful to establish certain statewide policies and procedures, right? And so what that looks like in HMIS land is that we have an HMIS statewide steering committee, and that steering committee meets once every quarter or so to discuss the policies and procedures, to discuss how the information is flowing. Most recently, it's been about the 2020 data standards. And what that looks like for our comparable database is we have a quarterly database work group where we come together, we talk about policies and procedures, which, can include security, training, pretty much anything that's affecting the data, right? So that's definitely been helpful in this journey to kind of have those, I use the term governing body here loosely because, it's that governing body is made up of user members, which is nice. So everybody kind of has a voice at that table. And then with collaboration with COCs, so I got started in this field coming from the domestic violence world. I was their database manager at a local program. I became their case manager and then statewide database coordinator and so forth before I transitioned over to HMIS and working in that homeless world. These are historically some pretty different groups, right? That's kind of a bigger leap there. And, as I made that transition, one of the things I noticed is that there was a lot of kind of tension between those two environments, right? There was a lot of kind of historical grudges. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but some historical misunderstandings, I think, might be a better way to say that. And so one of the things I discovered that really helped me in that transition, as well as the people that I was working with, the programs and the providers I was working with, is to be upfront about those regulations and what governs you, right? So from the DV world, we're talking about VAWA regs. I know when I transitioned to the homeless service provider, coming from VAWA, the VAWA regs were saying at max an ROI was worth about 15 days at absolute max. Within HMIS, they were telling me 2 years. So that was a huge leap for me. That was a huge kind of like mind-blowing, eye-opening instance. And so if you're coming from that DV world and you're wanting to start bridging those gaps into homeless service provider, into working with your COCs, things like that, I find that it's just best up front to tell them, this is how we operate. This is how we have to operate. It's not, just us. We haven't made these up. This is VAWA. Our ROIs are shorter than yours. Our ROIs are kind of, more specific. And I find that kind of getting to that point, like right off the bat, is a good way to start to tackle those programs. And again, why would you want to do that? Because of the federal funding set aside for DV. Last year was $50 million. The year before that was $50 million. We hope to see this again. And personally, from a personal standpoint, I hate leaving money on the table. So, they've set this money aside specifically for DV programs. There are some definitely interesting things that you can do with that funding. So look into it. It's a good resource to have. All right, so the next point I want to talk about is by name lists and other prioritization tools. So another kind of unique situation that I found myself in before I transitioned to my new role is that I was the chair of our by name list committee that met weekly. In that role, I just kind of facilitated the meetings and talked about, where the clients were at that time. And so the issue of how do we prioritize, how do we put clients that are fleeing DV or in a current shelter or that have experienced and survived sexual assault, how do we put them on our by name list? How do we prioritize them for housing? Because, just because that they're experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault doesn't mean that they're not homeless. They're a client too. We want to treat them the same as we treat our homeless clients. And so the kind of workaround that I came up with was that the DV organization would come up with a unique identifier that only that DV organization had. All identifying information was removed from that client except for that unique identifier. In the case of the DV program I work closely with, they used their in-house generated client ID number. And they would then submit that to me, that just the number, and I would manually put it into our by name list. And how we prioritized in that COC was we went off of their SPDAT, their VI SPDAT score, and then on down the road we started prioritizing VI SPDAT score, length of time homeless, and whether they were currently sheltered or unsheltered. So that's kind of how those the people in that DV program was going to be interacting with our by name list committee. And kind of my next point is that whether you're going to put your clients, your DV or SA clients, into that by name list or prioritization tool, it is critical for you to show up to these meetings, right? If you do apply for funding, the federal funding, you're going to have to report to HUD. It makes it just so much easier if you've already kind of got a seat at the table, a face that people recognize, right? When I started off, that was me. And by the time that I left, the community was so used to having that DV provider there at the table that it was a non-issue. It was just as if another provider was sitting there, which is really nice. So I cannot stress enough that just showing up, and I know everybody's busy and you're taking care of your clients, but it is very critical to show up and just start to have a presence at these meetings. So this is kind of the HUD decision tree about whether you should enter into a comparable database or not. Debbie, I didn't know if you wanted to speak on this a little bit, or if you wanted me to just keep on going.
I can just do a quick chime in. HUD has been helpful providing some guidance, and they hope to release more guidance on comparable database in the coming year. And this is just a quick thing. You can Google it on the HUD Exchange, but they have created a HUD decision tree because there's, with the new funding and victim service agencies receiving the funds, but then that are VAWA funded, but then also there's homeless service providers that receive the new DD bonus funds, but they also might potentially receive OVW transitional housing dollars. So this kind of helps you walk through. It's a little bit oversimplified. Like there are these sometimes head-scratching situations that we have to talk to HUD about, but it kind of gives you a a rundown of if you should be using a comparable database based on your various funding streams. So if you're getting VAWA, VOCA, or FVPSA, victim service funding specifically, and it's spread across your agency, then you would be wanting to use a comparable database and protecting the client information of people coming through your agency. But if you have any questions or are new to victim service funds or just got the DD bonus funds, or not quite sure if you need to use a comparable database, that's something that Jill and I or Aaron could definitely help walk through that and help you make that decision. So yeah, it's just a useful tool to kind of have the conversation, be thinking about it.
Great, thank you, Debbie. All right, so we're ending earlier than I had anticipated. Oh, there we go, safe partner. So anyway, before we continue on, there is my name and contact information. There's Debbie's and Jill's as well. So if you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk about this. I'm happy to talk about what solutions I've encountered, what solutions we're going forward with, all sorts of stuff like that. Happy to talk. We can answer questions in the chat now as well if anyone would like. Did you want to talk about the safe? Oh, there's a question. One moment. One moment, please.
So hi, this is Jill. Just going to jump in here and talk for a minute. So you'll see on the screen the Safe Housing Partnership slide, and just to give a little bit of information about that. So myself, Debbie, and 4 other federal partners are involved in the Domestic Violence Consortium, and we are here to help you with technical assistance needs and requests. We do invite you to go to the Safe Housing Partnership website and submit any requests that you might have if you need help with whatever might come up, because I'm sure there are plenty of things that will come up when you start implementing your housing projects. So feel free to reach out to us. Also wanted to just make a plug. We have begun to send out information about our 2020 National Safe Housing Conference. It'll be in DC in October. The dates are the 27th through the 30th. So please stay tuned for more information, but save that date if you could. We would love to see you in DC at that conference. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron or Debbie.
Great. Thank you. All right. So there are some questions about if I'm able to speak to what solutions. Gotcha. What solutions that I looked at, which I am more than happy to share. I'm not. Is this an okay space to do that in?
We're not, we're not NHSTC. So there's one conference that we go to, which I actually will do a plug for that conference too. For those who are learning more about comparable databases and want to know about HUD, and if you're in the reporting world and that side of the comparable database part of your job, there's a biannual conference called the National Human Services Data Consortium. And that's where I just say the HUD data nerds come together twice a year, and you learn about what's coming down the pike from HUD, what's going to change with the data reporting. There is also strategy conversations and critical conversations around things in the coordinated entry in the homelessness field that come up. I find it to be a very useful space to just to be thinking about what needs to happen around ensuring survivors have data privacy, and we always try to present, Erin's presented there, and Collaborative Solutions and I, so it's a great space. But they do, that's a long way to say it's a vendor-neutral space, and so, Erin, you're welcome to talk about what your process was and what vendors you looked at, but I do want to make the caveat that NNADV and Collaborative Solutions, like, we don't rubber stamp and say, this is your solution and this is a database that you should use. It really varies. Some people want cloud-based, some people want server-based, and a lot of software companies, like there was a software company called Alice many years ago that just kind of went out of business overnight, and that left the field in the lurch trying to figure out what to do. So we can talk about databases, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be your end-all, be-all, solve all of your problems, or because these are private companies, software companies, they're in the private market, and they sometimes are bought out or they close shop. So there might be one that's selected, for example, what Erin used or is using in West Virginia, but that there's still a process of like questions and things to be thinking about as you're selecting a comparable database. So that's our caveat. We're not giving the stamp of approval, but it's good to have a conversation and know what software vendors are out there.
Sure, great. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, so Pamela, to answer your question, West Virginia has been using Osmium software, which is a company based out of Canada. Now Osmium does everything that you need it to do. But we kind of started having a conversation that, what are some of the other options out there, which is how I really got into looking at different solutions. And so I looked at quite a few and demoed quite a few, and then took those back to that comparable database work group I spoke about earlier to kind of show the ones that really stuck out, kind of to the larger group. And so, as we've gone forward, the one that we're very excited about and the one that we're looking at is a database called Empower DB, as in database. We're quite excited about them because, they have kind of this ease of access, which is nice for our users that has unfortunately been a little lacking. They're able to, export all the information that we need. They are a cloud-based program, and they contract through the Microsoft Azure servers, which Microsoft Azure does do what's called a zero-knowledge encryption, which is exciting for me. I'm very much in that category of the data nerds that Debbie was speaking to for a minute. That zero-knowledge encryption essentially means that the people that are maintaining the servers have no access to that data. I mean, they've got access to it, but they can't decipher it, right? It's completely jumbled, which is really nice. Oh, okay, so you're familiar with EmpowerDB. Great. A few of the other ones that we kind of just briefly looked at was Time CDS, Time as in the herb, and then CDS as comparable database solutions. And then we also looked at Apricot. I never remember how to pronounce that one. We looked at that one as well, and then Cap60 reached out to us, but we didn't really go anywhere with Cap60. I wasn't able to kind of nail down anything. Oh, I'm so sorry. We also looked at Service Point. And, Service Point, great product. However, it was the pricing was not doable. We have some more questions coming in. Pricing wasn't so much of an issue with Apricot. but we, you know, as Debbie said, that, you know, every solution is going to be different for your needs, so on and so forth. And just for West Virginia's needs, EmpowerDB was looking a little better than Apricot in that regards. Oh, they've been out of communication since last year. Huh. Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to them, EmpowerDB, pretty frequently. They've been very good to communicate with me. You know, we're still kind of in those early stages, right?
Yeah, I think, Sean, you raised a point that I was saying earlier. Like, I think with all the new DD bonus money, I'm making an assumption. I haven't chatted with them directly, but I do think with all the new money and the new resources going out, there is an increase in the need for a comparable database, and I'm assuming that's driving the increased requests, and they're probably growing as a software company. So that's one of those things where it is like it's still a company, and they're trying to like meet the need, but I'm assuming that's what's happened, but not sure.
And Pamela, yes, we haven't contracted yet. We are in the, we have a contract. We're in the process of negotiation at this time. As for Caseworthy, I don't have experience with Caseworthy. Client Track is my new employer, or current employer, I should say.
That's your disclosure, huh?
Yeah. There's going to be 14 domestic violence programs and about 3 sexual assault programs. When I say 3 sexual assault programs, please keep in mind that those are just standalone sexual assault programs. Most of the 14, I think it's maybe 11 or 12 of that 14 are dual programs. But they'll all be on that same statewide database program, just, again, siloed instances. These are great questions. Thank you, everybody. When you're, Laura, when you say an EHR type database, are you referring to like the medical type? Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of experience with the EHR type databases. I've really only interacted with one. Oh gosh, what was that name? And it's been a minute ago, but they were always down. I'll have to do some digging on that.
Yeah, I do want to do a quick plug or just a clarification. So when Aaron describes a statewide database or having a statewide response, it's more from the management perspective and organizing the programs and doing TA. There's some benefits to having a statewide response, but as long as the data, the VAWA regs say no third party can have access to that information, that client's information that lives within your agency. So that would include your state domestic violence coalition, that would include your software database person, that would include the victim service agency that you're partnered with across the street. Like, no, it's still you are owning that information, and it's your responsibility to keep it protected and not to share that personally identifiable information with other organizations. So I just wanted to clarify that. So states, many states like Texas, Iowa, the DC Coalition, Georgia, there's a lot of states that have had this statewide response and taken on leadership and organizing of the database so they can report to HUD for those folks that get the HUD Continuum of Care funds, but often they also use the databases for the victim service funds that come through from the feds as well, like the VAWA, OVW, and FVPSA and OVC funds. So it's still private. The information is private, and it still needs to be protected and confidential within that victim service organization. So I just want to clarify that we're not talking about statewide database and everyone around the state can look at it. Like, that's not the setup.
Thank you, Debbie. There was a question earlier from Tina. How many of the vendors that I mentioned were both comparable databases and VAWA compliant? Osmium and Empower are, but you mentioned a few others I'm not certain about. So Osmium and Empower were compliant as far as I could tell, yes. Well, Osmium, obviously, and Empower, yes. And then Andrea was saying that Apricot is as well, which is great. Some of the ones that I encountered, CAP 60 was not compliant. There were a few other smaller ones that weren't really compliant either. And let's see. Yeah, so John asks, can I describe exactly what counts as personally identifying information and what does not? So this is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about. So personally identifying information, the best way that you can really think about that is any piece of information you can use to identify somebody. And so what we usually go towards, just kind of in our minds, is name, date of birth, social security number, things like that. But in the data world, in the service world, there are some other things that you need to keep in mind as well, especially, for example, how I used to train people back home is, you know, it's a smaller community back home in West Virginia, and so all of those communities are pretty small. So within small communities, you pretty much know who is who. To kind of give you an example, I'm about 6 feet 4 inches tall. I've got a beard. You know, I'm a data nerd, and I wear funky shirts, like Hawaiian shirts, and that's just my aesthetic. The reason I tell you that is because if you talk to somebody that you saw a tall guy with a beard that wore funky Hawaiian shirts, you haven't given out my name, date of birth, or social, but you have kind of personally identified me in a smaller community. So those are things that you definitely need to kind of think about as you go forward with personally identifying information. I hope that helps.
There's a question from Araceli that asks, is efforts to outcome compliant? I think the question and a good place to get information, there's the NADB Tech Safety website, and there's a whole section on comparable databases. I think the question that is really critical to ask the software company that you're working with or the software developer is, do you have access to that information? And oftentimes they say, like, we're HIPAA compliant or everything's secure, don't worry about it. But we have a higher stringent standard than HIPAA. And then the critical question is often asking, like, well, what if you got a subpoena, or what if there was some sort of like requirement from the government? Like, would you turn over information as a software developer? So there's critical questions to ask that we have in some of our technical assistance information for the NADB Safety Net website portion of our website. So that is helpful. It's kind of asking those questions of how are you keeping the client information confidential, and what kind of access as a software developer would you have access to, and what kind of protections are there from data breaches and those sorts of things that happen with data that's stored on the cloud.
And yes, Pamela, Ecovia puts out client track. So that is my disclosure, as Debbie said earlier. Yes, they do have HMIS. Currently, yeah, they have HMIS. But now they've got me, so we'll see what the future holds. Okay. Yeah, Apricot is kind of a popular one. That was one of the bigger ones we really took a look at. It was actually at the NHSDC that someone in attendance there turned me on to EmpowerDB. We love your questions. Thank you. Okay, well, that's about all I've got. The questions seem to be slowing down. Debbie or Jill, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything more.
I just want to thank everybody for joining. You know, it's almost the holidays, and we are talking about databases, and we have over 61 people on the call, so I think that's a record for a comparable database webinar that we've hosted. So thanks for joining, everybody, and I'm just so appreciative, Erin, of your partnership and for offering this webinar and sharing your information, and thanks, Jill, for joining. Jill, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, just two quick things. One is, Erin, thank you very much for doing the presentation. You did a great job, so thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to just remind people is when you're looking for your database, be sure to ask the vendors all those really hard questions. Debbie mentioned that on the NNEDD website, there's a good list of questions that you can be considering. One of those questions I know came up towards the end with some of the products. Make sure that they can produce those HUD reports that are required. Make sure that you see that they can actually produce those reports, especially if you're receiving DV bonus funds or ESG or COC funds. Super important question. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with any of us. We're happy to talk offline as well. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I pulled up the contact information just for another quick second before we disconnect. But again, thank you everyone so much for attending. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Jill. I hope everybody got some information out of this, and please feel free to contact me with any questions you may have.